The car had been wrong for 5 years, not dramatically wrong. Not the catastrophic wrong of a seized engine or a burned transmission, or the kind of mechanical failure that announced itself clearly and had a clear solution. The specific, maddening wrong of a car that ran beautifully most of the time and then, under certain conditions that no one had been able to reproduce consistently in a shop environment, misfired in a way that was immediately recognizable to anyone who had ever heard a 12-cylinder engine operating correctly. Because a 12-cylinder engine operating correctly was one of the most distinctive sounds in the mechanical world, and anything that interrupted that sound was detectable even to someone who could not have explained precisely what they were hearing. Claire Fontaine had been hearing it for 5 years. She had heard it in the summer of 2018 when her father's 1968 Ferrari 275 GTB4 had first demonstrated the problem on a mountain road in Vermont, and she had heard it intermittently since, through 5 years of specialist visits and 3 transatlantic shipments and 2 comprehensive restorations and 1 complete engine rebuild, and approximately $2 million in repair and restoration expenses spread across the most reputable Ferrari specialist operations in the United States and England and Italy. The car still misfired. Not every time, not predictably, under specific conditions of sustained load and temperature that seemed to vary slightly with the weather and the altitude and factors that none of the specialists had been able to identify conclusively. The engine would stumble at the top of its power band in a way that lasted between 3 and 8 seconds and then resolved. And the car would continue running as though nothing had happened, which was in some ways the most maddening part. Because a car that failed obviously and consistently could be diagnosed, and a car that failed subtly and intermittently defeated every diagnostic approach that modern Ferrari specialists had brought to bear on it across 5 years of trying. Claire was 58 years old. She had inherited the car from her father, who had bought it new in 1968 when he was 26 years old and working as an architect in New York, and who had kept it for 50 years in the specific way that people kept things they considered important, which was to say carefully and with consistent attention, and with the understanding that the keeping was part of the relationship with the thing rather than an alternative to using it. Her father had driven the 275 GTB4 every summer on road trips through New England and the Mid-Atlantic states until 2015, when his health had made driving impractical, and had passed it to Claire when he passed in 2017 with the instruction that she should drive it, not store it, because a car that was not driven was not being treated correctly. She had driven it, and it had misfired. The first specialist, a shop in Westchester County, had charged her $80,000 over 6 months to inspect and tune the car, had said the problem was in the carburation, had rebuilt the 6 Weber 38 DCN carburetors that fed the Colombo V12 engine, and had returned the car with a clean bill of health. The misfire had reappeared within a month. The second specialist, a shop in Maranello with direct Ferrari factory connections, had taken the car for 8 months and had performed what they described as a comprehensive mechanical assessment, and had found, they said, a small variance in the valve timing on 2 cylinders that they corrected, and that they were confident was the source of the intermittent behavior. The misfire had reappeared within 2 months of the car's return. The third specialist, the most expensive of the series, a restoration shop in Worcestershire, England, that had worked on more 275 GTB4 cars than any other operation in the world, and whose principal had been building and restoring these cars for 40 years, had taken the car for 14 months. He had rebuilt the engine completely. He had sourced new old stock components for the carburetor float valves. He had gone through every system on the car with the attention of someone who had devoted his professional life to understanding these specific cars in a way that nobody else in the world understood them. He had returned the car with a written guarantee and a letter describing in detail what had been done, and expressing his personal confidence that the behavior Claire had described would not recur. The misfire had reappeared on the drive home from the shipping container. The Worcestershire specialist had refunded a portion of his fee and had expressed in a letter that Claire had kept because it was the most honest thing any of the specialists had said, that he did not know what was causing the behavior, and that his honest assessment was that it was an interaction between multiple factors that were within the design tolerances of the components individually, but that produced the anomaly collectively under specific conditions that he had not been able to reproduce in his shop environment, and that he was not certain anyone could reproduce without access to the specific road conditions under which it appeared. Claire had read this letter 3 times and had filed it with the other documentation, and had decided that she needed a different approach. She lived in Albemarle County, Virginia, on a small farm that she had bought in 2010 as a weekend and retirement property, and that she had been living in full-time since 2021, when she sold the consultancy she had been running for 22 years. The consultancy had been in organizational strategy, the specific work of going into organizations that were not functioning correctly and identifying why and recommending how to change them. And Claire had been very good at it for a long time and had found it, in her last years running it, increasingly frustrating. Not because the problems had gotten harder, but because the organizations had gotten more attached to the solutions they had already tried, and less willing to consider that the problem might be fundamentally different from what they had diagnosed it as. She thought about this parallel occasionally, in the way that people thought about parallels between their professional experiences and their personal frustrations. The Ferrari problem had the same shape as the organizational problems that had frustrated her most in the consultancy. Everyone who had looked at it had approached it with the solution set of their expertise and had found the problem within that solution set and had addressed the problem they found and had not fixed the behavior, because the behavior was caused by something outside their solution set that they were not equipped to see. The question was who had a different solution set. She had been asking this question for several months when she mentioned the car at a dinner party in Charlottesville to a woman named Margaret, who bred horses on a property in the western part of the county, and who had the specific social knowledge of someone who had been embedded in the local community for 30 years, and who knew everyone who was worth knowing in a substantial radius. Margaret had asked a number of questions about the problem and had said she did not know anything about Ferraris, but that she knew a man in the northern part of the county who had worked on racing cars in the 1960s and 1970s, and who was, by the account of everyone who had ever seen him work on machinery, the most mechanically knowledgeable person in Albemarle County and possibly in the state of Virginia. Claire had asked who the man was. Margaret had said his name was Eldon Pierce, and that he was 74 years old and farmed about 90 acres up near Earlysville, and that he had not worked on cars professionally in over 40 years, but that he had kept all his tools, and that several people in the county had approached him over the years with mechanical problems that nobody else could solve, and that he had solved most of them. Claire had asked if Margaret thought Eldon Pierce would look at a 1968 Ferrari 275 GTB4 with an intermittent misfire that had defeated 5 years of specialist repair. Margaret had said she had no idea, but that the way to find out was to ask. Eldon Pierce's property was off a county road in the hills north of Earlysville, a working farm with the specific character of a place that had been managed consistently for a long time by someone who knew what they were doing. The house was not large, but was in good repair. The equipment shed held a tractor and a haymower and a brush hog and a collection of tools organized with a precision that distinguished someone who used tools from someone who owned them. In the back of the equipment shed, behind the farm equipment, was a different set of tools entirely, housed in a red metal chest with 6 drawers and a cabinet section on the right side that was closed with a latch rather than a lock. The kind of tool chest that had been designed for someone who needed to keep a very specific and very expensive set of precision instruments organized and accessible. Eldon Pierce was a large man who had reduced over the years in the way that men who did physical work for decades reduced, not to thinness, but to the specific economy of motion and mass that came from a lifetime of doing what the work required, rather than more than was necessary. He had a quality of attention that Claire noticed when she came to the property with the car on a flatbed and introduced herself. which was the quality of someone who listened completely before speaking, not as a courtesy but as a function of how he processed information, which was to gather it fully before analyzing it. He had listened to her describe the problem without interrupting. She had described the conditions under which the misfire appeared, the work that the three specialists had done, the Worcestershire specialist's letter about the interaction of factors within design tolerances, and the history of the car back to her father's purchase of it in 1968. She had brought the Worcestershire specialist's letter and the service records from all three shops and had laid them on the workbench in the equipment shed, and Eldon had read them in order, completely, before saying anything. When he finished reading, he had set the last document down and had looked at the car for a long time. The 275 GTB4 was outside the equipment shed in the October afternoon light, a long hood coupe in a dark blue that had faded slightly over 56 years to the specific blue of something that had been in sunlight for a very long time, and it had the presence of certain cars that came from the combination of age and beauty and mechanical reputation, the presence of something that was worth looking at. He had asked her to start the car. She had started it. The 12 cylinders fired in sequence and settled into the specific idle of a Colombo V12 that was correctly tuned, which was a sound that Eldon had not heard in 40 years, but that he recognized with the immediacy of something that had been part of his working life for 12 years, and that the intervening 40 years had not displaced from his auditory memory. He had crouched beside the car with his ear near the left side of the engine compartment for 2 minutes without speaking. Then he had walked to the right side and done the same. He had straightened up and had asked Claire to rev the engine to 4,000 RPM and hold it there for 30 seconds and then drop it back to idle. She had done this twice. He had listened both times from the same position on the left side of the engine compartment. He had said, without introducing the statement with anything, that the left bank of carburetors was running leaner than the right bank under sustained load, and that the variance was probably not in the carburetors themselves, which had clearly been rebuilt competently, but in the float valve seats, and specifically in the interaction between the float valve seats and the fuel pressure at the left bank's fuel rail under sustained high demand conditions, which created a situation in which the float valves on the left bank closed fractionally early, when the fuel pressure dropped at the beginning of each demand cycle, and which produced a momentary lean condition that was brief enough not to appear as a consistent diagnostic code, but long enough to be detectable to the ear and to the engine's behavior under load. Claire had looked at him. She had said that the Worcestershire specialist had rebuilt every component in the fuel delivery system, including the float valves. Eldon had said yes, he could see from the service records that the components had been replaced, and that the issue was not the components, but the float valve seats in the carburetor bodies themselves, which were the machined surfaces against which the float valves sealed, and that those seats in the left bank carburetors showed wear that was specific to the 38 DCN carburetors in the 1968 production year. And that involved a very slight ovality in the seat that developed from 50 years of use, and that was difficult to detect without measuring under the specific conditions of fuel pressure and temperature that the problem manifested under, and that the Worcestershire specialist would not have been looking for it, because it was not in the standard rebuild procedure for these carburetors, and because it required measuring the seat geometry under running conditions rather than in a static rebuild environment. Claire had said, very carefully, how did he know what was in the standard rebuild procedure for Weber 38 DCN carburetors? Eldon had said he had rebuilt approximately 60 of them between 1967 and 1981, working for a race preparation shop in Richmond, Virginia, that had specialized in Italian sports cars, and that he had encountered the ovality issue in the 1968 production year carburetors on 3 previous occasions, one of which had taken him several weeks to diagnose before he understood what he was looking at, and that the diagnosis on those 3 previous occasions had required the same approach he had just used, which was listening to the engine at sustained load rather than analyzing it with instruments in a static environment. Claire had been quiet for a moment. She had said she had spent $2 million and 5 years on this problem. Eldon had said he was sorry to hear that, He said the problem was solvable, and that he had the instruments to measure the seat geometry under the conditions that produced the ovality signature, and that if the measurement confirmed what he believed he was hearing, the repair required relapping the seats in the left bank carburetors to restore the correct geometry, which was a procedure he had done before, and that he had the lapping equipment for in the red chest in the equipment shed. Claire had said she would like him to proceed. He had said he would look at the carburetors first to confirm the diagnosis before committing to the repair, and that he would tell her what he found. He removed the 3 left bank carburetors from the engine the following morning, which required 2 hours of careful work that Claire watched from a chair she had brought from the farmhouse at Eldon's suggestion, and which he performed with the specific economy of motion of someone who had done the same task a sufficient number of times that the procedure was organized in his hands before his mind completed the sequence. He took the carburetors to his workbench and measured the float valve seats with a set of bore gauges from the red chest that he explained. When Claire asked, were the instruments he had used in the Richmond shop, and that he had maintained with the same attention he gave to the farm equipment, because precision instruments maintained their accuracy, and imprecise instruments were not useful. The measurement confirmed what he had heard. The seats in all 3 left bank carburetors showed ovality ranging from 0.07 to 0.11 inches, which was within the general specification for the component, but outside the specific tolerance that was required for the float valve to seal correctly under the fuel pressure conditions that the left bank experienced under sustained high-demand running. The right bank carburetors, which Eldon also removed and measured for comparison, were within specification. The left bank had developed the ovality asymmetrically, which explained why the problem appeared only under load and only at the specific RPM range where the fuel demand differential between the 2 banks created the pressure condition that exposed the sealing deficiency. He showed Claire the measurements on a notepad, the numbers for each seat position in each carburetor, the ovality values, and the specification range. He said the Worcestershire specialists' rebuild had replaced the float valves and the seats with new old stock components, but had not measured the carburetor bodies themselves under running conditions, and that the ovality was in the machined bodies rather than in the replaceable components, and that standard rebuild procedure did not include measurement of the body geometry, because the issue was sufficiently uncommon that it was not in the written procedure for the rebuild. He said the repair was lapping the seats back to round within specification, which required the specific lapping tools in the red chest and approximately 2 hours of careful work per carburetor body, and that the left bank had 3 carburetors for a total of 6 hours of lapping plus the reassembly and the verification running. Claire asked how he intended to verify the repair. He said he intended to drive the car. She had looked at him. He had said that the problem only appeared under sustained load at specific road conditions, and that the only verification that was worth anything was driving the car under those conditions and confirming that the behavior did not appear. He said if she was comfortable with that, he would drive it on the county roads in the hills above Earlysville, where the grades were sufficient to create the sustained load conditions the engine had been failing under, and that he would know within 20 minutes of driving whether the lapping had addressed the problem or whether there was a residual issue that needed further work. She had said she was comfortable with that. He had driven the car for 40 minutes on a Tuesday morning in late October on a route through the hills north of Earlysville that he had chosen specifically for the sustained grades that produced the load conditions the engine needed to be tested under. Claire had followed in her own car. When Eldon brought the Ferrari back to the property and parked it and got out, he had said the engine had run clean through every condition he had been able to test, and that he believed the repair was complete. Claire had driven the car the following day on the same route, alone, and then again the day after that with Eldon following in his truck so that she could describe in real time what she was experiencing. On both drives, the engine ran without the misfire she had been living with for 5 years. She had asked Eldon what he charged. He had said he charged for the labor at a day rate he considered fair, and for the lapping compound he had used, which was the standard abrasive he had ordered from a supplier in the late 1970s, and kept on the shelf, because he had known that the day would come when the lapping equipment in the red chest would be needed again. The amount he named was so much smaller than the 5-year cumulative cost that Claire had spent the following morning going back through the arithmetic to make sure she had heard correctly. She had heard correctly. She had asked him why he had kept the tools. He had said that when he left the Richmond shop in 1981 and came back to the farm his father had left him, he had known that the farming was what needed doing and that the car work was in the past, but that the tools were precision instruments of a specific kind that had taken years to learn to use and that would not be replaced if he sold them, and that would be available if they were needed, and that keeping them had cost him nothing except the space in the equipment shed and the attention to maintain them in usable condition, which was the same attention he gave to everything he kept. Claire had said that the 3 specialists who had worked on the car before him were considered the best in the world at what they did. Eldon had said he believed that. He said the best in the world at rebuilding Ferrari carburetors to specification was not the same as the best in the world at finding what was wrong with a specific Ferrari's carburetors when the problem was outside the standard specification, and that those were 2 different skill sets, and that the second one required a kind of listening that was not in any service manual, and that came from building up the specific mental model of how these carburetors behaved when they were wrong, that you could only build across many years of working with them and many iterations of the wrong behavior. He said he had been lucky enough to encounter the specific failure mode 3 times before 1981, and that experience was the thing that made the difference, and that luck was what it was. Claire had driven the 275 GTB4 back to her farm on the county road in the October afternoon and had parked it in the garage where it had been sitting between specialist visits for 5 years and had stood beside it for a while listening to the engine cool. The specific sequence of small sounds that a hot engine made as the metal contracted. Sounds she had heard many times but had not been able to enjoy because of the misfire that had shadowed every drive since 2018. She called her father's name aloud in the empty garage, not to say anything specific, because he would have wanted to know that it was fixed, and that it had been fixed by a man who had learned his trade in 1967 and who had kept his tools for 40 years against the day when the knowledge in them would be needed. The car ran. It ran the way her father had driven it for 50 years before the problem started, cleanly and without interruption at every RPM range and every load condition. The 12 cylinders operating in the sequence that the Colombo Vida 12 had been producing since Gioacchino Colombo designed it in 1946, as close to correct as a machine built in 1968 could be in the present, which was very close indeed when the person who had worked on it last knew exactly what he was listening for and had the instruments and the patience and the 40 years of tool maintenance to find it. The red chest had been in the equipment shed since 1981, the year Eldon had come back to the farm after his father's death and had driven the last load of shop tools from the Richmond property, where the race preparation business had operated for 14 years. He had not left the shop because the work was finished, or because he had stopped caring about it. He had left because the farm needed someone to run it, and he was the only person in a position to do so. And because when his father had built that farm across 30 years of tobacco and cattle, it had become something worth preserving. And preserving it required someone who understood it the way Eldon understood the car work, with complete and sustained attention. The tool chest had not been opened in the first decade he was farming. It had sat in the back of the equipment shed under a canvas tarp, and Eldon had thought about it occasionally in the way that people thought about things they had set aside rather than given up. He had opened it in 1992 when a neighbor brought a tractor with a hydraulic problem that the John Deere dealer in Charlottesville said required a new pump at a cost the neighbor could not afford. Eldon had measured the pump clearances with a set of dial indicators from the chest and found the pump serviceable with a seal kit, had machined the worn seal surfaces on the metal lathe in the back of the shed, and had charged what the repair was worth. The neighbor had paid it without complaint, and Eldon had put the tools back in the chest and gone back to farming. He had maintained the instruments on the schedule that Precision Instruments required, annual calibration and cleaning, because instruments that were not maintained drifted in ways that made them worse than no instruments at all. He had a calibration standard for each instrument, gauge blocks, and reference specimens of known dimension. In 40 years, this discipline had required replacing 3 items. The discipline had been what the Richmond shop had drilled into him in his first year there, when he was 22 years old, hired as a machinist's helper by a man named Vincent, who had come from a Lancia dealership in Milan in 1958 and built a race preparation and restoration business in Richmond, serving Italian sports car owners across Virginia and the Carolinas. Vincent had not believed a car was a car. He had believed that a Ferrari 275 GTB4 was a specific instrument built to specific tolerances for specific purposes, and that working on it correctly required understanding those purposes and those tolerances in their own terms. He had taught this to Eldon across 12 years. The work began with cleaning carburetors and ended with Eldon performing all the carburation work independently, while Vincent handled the engine internals, because they had divided the labor according to what each was best at, and Eldon had turned out to be better with carburetors than Vincent, who acknowledged this without drama, and trusted Eldon with the carburation on every car in the shop from 1973 forward. Eldon had been sorry to leave. Vincent had said he understood, and that the knowledge was in Eldon's hands, and that his hands would remember when something needed to be remembered. Eldon had thought about this on the Tuesday morning in October of 2023, when he crouched beside the 275 GTB4 and listened to the engine at sustained RPM, and heard in the asymmetry between the left and right bank exhaust notes the specific signature he had heard 3 times before and understood on the second occurrence and could name precisely on the third. Vincent had been right. The knowledge had stayed through 40 years of farming. It had been available in full when the car that needed it arrived. Claire Fontaine had come back to the farm twice after the repair, not for mechanical reasons, but in the way that people came back to places where something significant had happened. She had sat with Eldon in the equipment shed on the second visit and talked about the car and about Vincent's shop, and about what 40 years of farming had been and what it had given him. Eldon had said the farming and the car work were not as different as they looked from the outside. He said both rewarded the same quality of attention, which was the sustained, specific patient attention to what the thing in front of you was actually doing rather than what you expected it to do. He said Vincent had told him when he was 22 that the difference between a mechanic who fixed things and a mechanic who understood things was what you paid attention to when nothing was obviously wrong, and that he had been applying that principle to machinery and farmland for 50 years and it had not yet been wrong. Claire had said she ran a consultancy for 20 years, telling organizations something very similar, and that they had been as hard to convince as the Ferrari specialists had been, which was to say, not convinced until the evidence was undeniable. Eldon said he supposed that was the way of it with most things. She asked if he had any regrets about leaving the car work. He thought about it honestly. He said no, that the farm had needed doing and was worth doing, and that the car work was still there when it was needed, as the red chest demonstrated, and that he had managed to have both things by understanding which was the present work and which was the knowledge to carry forward, and by not confusing the two. She said that was a useful distinction. He said it was the distinction that mattered in most things. She had driven home on the county road in the October dark in her own car, while the 275 GTB4 sat in her garage in the correct condition it had not been in for 5 years, and thought about what it meant to find the right person, at the end of a search that had been expensive and frustrating, and that had been resolved not by the most credentialed people in the field, but by a man who had kept his tools in good calibration for 40 years, and who had listened to an engine for 2 minutes and heard what needed to be heard. She stood in the dark garage and told her father what Eldon had found and what it had cost. She said she thought he would have liked Eldon, because Eldon was the kind of person her father had always said was the most useful kind to know, which was the kind who kept their knowledge in good calibration and was available when the calibration was needed. The engine cooled in the dark garage. Outside in the October hills of Albemarle County, the farms were settling into the end of their working year. In the equipment shed north of Earlysville, the red chest stood in its place, the instruments calibrated, the tools maintained, the knowledge available in Eldon's hands for whatever arrived next that needed what it contained. The car ran. That was the whole of what 5 years and $2 million had been trying to find. Not in 3 specialist shops across 2 continents, in a working farm in the Virginia hills, in the hands of a man who had kept his knowledge and his tools in correct calibration for 40 years against the day when the right car arrived, and the listening that Vincent had taught him in Richmond in 1967 would be exactly what was needed. It had arrived. He had listened. The car ran. The 3 specialists who had preceded Eldon had each possessed, in their respective domains, the deepest available expertise in the world on Ferrari 275 GTB14 restoration and maintenance. This was not in question. The Westchester shop had rebuilt more Weber 38 DCN carburetors than virtually any other operation in North America. The Maranello shop had factory access and relationships that were unavailable to any outside operation. The Worcestershire shop's principal had devoted his professional life to these specific cars with a thoroughness that was recognized throughout the Ferrari collector community as exceptional. None of them had fixed the car. The reason was not incompetence. The reason was that the problem existed at the intersection of 56 years of use, a specific production year variance in the carburetor body machining, and a failure mode that only manifested under the combination of sustained load and temperature that was difficult to reproduce in a shop environment. Solving it required someone who had encountered the specific failure mode before, who had the instruments to measure it under the conditions that produced it, and who had the experience to recognize what they were hearing before they had the measurement to confirm it. Those 3 requirements together described, in the fall of 2023, one person in Albemarle County, Virginia. Claire had thought about this after the repair, about the specific combination of circumstances that had produced the solution after 5 years of failure, and had concluded that the lesson was not that old farmers knew more than Ferrari specialists, which was not a general truth, but that the right knowledge for a specific problem was sometimes found in an unexpected place, and that finding it required being willing to look in that place, even when it did not match the expected profile of where the solution should come from. She had applied this principle in her consultancy for 20 years. She had found in organizations that were not functioning correctly that the person who understood the problem most clearly was often not the person with the most relevant credentials, but the person who had been paying the most careful attention to the specific system for the longest time. She had acted on this principle many times in her professional life and had been right often enough that it was close to a rule for her. She had not applied it to the car because the car was not a consulting problem. It was her father's Ferrari and it was broken, and the broken thing had taken her to the expected sources, and the expected sources had taken $2 million and 5 years and had not fixed it. And the unexpected source had fixed it in 3 days for an amount that was, in the context of what had preceded it, almost embarrassingly modest. She had told Eldon this on her second visit. She had said she should have come to him first. He had said he did not see how she would have known to come to him, since there was no obvious reason why a farmer in Earlysville would be the person to consult about a Ferrari 275 GTB4 carburation problem. She had said she had known through a mutual acquaintance, which was how most of the useful knowledge in any community traveled, and that the lesson was to ask more people who knew the community before assuming that the credentialed sources were the only sources. Eldon had said that was a reasonable way to think about it. He said in farming the same principle applied, that the person who had farmed adjacent land for 30 years knew things about the soil and the water and the weather patterns that no soil survey had captured, and that the beginning of any serious farming question was asking that person before going to the extension office, not because the extension office was wrong, but because the local knowledge was the starting point for the right questions. Claire had said she wished she had started with the local knowledge on the Ferrari. She said it would have saved her considerable time and money. Eldon had said the car was fixed now, and that what it had taken to fix it was what it had taken, and that dwelling on the path was less useful than noting where the path had ended. He said it had ended at a working farm with a red tool chest, which was not where any reasonable person would have predicted it would end, and that this was consistent with his experience of most things that were genuinely difficult, which was that they resolved where they resolved rather than where the search began. He had gone back to checking the fence line after that, because the fence line needed checking, and the conversation was complete, and Claire had driven back to her farm on the county road in the afternoon light, and the 275 GTB4 was in the garage running correctly, and that was the whole of what the story had been. Eldon Pierce farmed his 90 acres in the hills north of Earlysville through the following seasons in the same way he had farmed them through all the preceding seasons, which was correctly and with the sustained attention that correctly required and without particular interest in whether anyone outside the farm's immediate community was aware of what he did or how he did it. The red chest was in the equipment shed. The instruments were calibrated. He was available when something arrived that needed what the chest contained. Something always did, eventually, in its own time, in the way that the right need and the right knowledge found each other when neither of them was being forced, which was the way that most of the genuinely important meetings happened, between the thing that was broken and the person who knew how to fix it, in the specific place and the specific moment that the combination of circumstances produced. He did not know what the next thing would be. He kept the chest calibrated and went back to work. That was the whole of it.